Hey y'all, so today we're going to be going over genetics, and please keep in mind, I don't know how to pronounce some of these words, so if I don't say it right, just overlook it. So these are the terms to keep in mind, and you kind of need to learn these so everything else that we're going to talk about makes sense. DNA is a molecule that carries genetic instructions for literally everything. A gene is the segment of the DNA that codes for a specific trait. RNA is a molecule that helps translating DNA into proteins. Genotype is the actual gene in the allele, and phenotype is the physical trait that you can actually observe and see. Homozygous is two identical alleles, and heterozygous is two different alleles. A dominant allele is when it only needs one to be present and it'll kind of take over. Recessive, two copies need to be present, and autosomal dominant and recessive kind of go hand in hand with that. And X-linked is a genetic trait or disorder associated with the genes on the X chromosome. So let's talk about the Human Genome Project. This was a research study from 1990 to 2003, and it mapped the human genome, which identified basically the human blueprint. It linked so many diseases to genes and health conditions, and it opened the door for pharmacogenics, which led to personalized medication and stuff like that. Let's talk about DNA. What's the law of the DNA? The DNA is found in the nucleus of the cells. And what's inside of this? All cells contain genetic information that's inherited from the egg and sperm. And duplication. DNA must be copied and divided before cell division happens. It looks like a twisted ladder and is also known as a double helix. Keep in mind, if DNA damage is not repaired, it can lead to abnormalities. Let's talk about genes. Genes are the same in every cell, and there's 23,000 genes in a cell, but not all of them are active or expressed in the cell. And while these genes are duplicating, change can happen, and this is called mutations. But the impact or the effect of the mutation depends on when it happens. So these genes come together and they form chromosomes. So chromosomes store the genetic information created by DNA and RNA, and it's arranged in pairs, one from your mom and one from your dad, and each one has a specific structure. You have 23 pairs, and only one of them are sex chromosomes. They're different in male and female. RNA arises from transcribed DNA, and it lives in the cytoplasm. It carries the needed amino acids to build proteins, and it carries the directions, and it's just the location. So when you think about protein, you can think about RNA. So gene regulation, we kind of already talked about the active genes and the DNA in cells and the mutations. But keep in mind, somatic cell mutations cause disease for you, but mutation of germ cells, they cause disease and they can be passed off to your offspring. Now let's get into recombinant DNA technology. DNA is split, so it's basically cut into pieces and it's altered and modified. Then the DNA is inserted to one cell organism, and then it replicates the DNA you just inserted. And the final result is the desired product will be extracted from the organism. Let's talk about penetrance and expressivity. Penetrance refers to the likelihood your phenotype will reflect your genotype. So if you have colon cancer, penetrance is how likely you'll get colon cancer. So even though you have the gene, it'll be like, oh, you have an 80% chance of getting it. Expressivity is how pronounced the phenotype will be. Like if you inherited hypercholesterolemia, how high will your cholesterol be? Or if you have a big nose, if you have the gene for a big nose, how big is your nose? Now let's talk about X-linked disorders, and these usually affects males because they don't have that extra X to balance stuff. Females are rarely affected because they have two affected X's. So fathers pass the defective if the fathers have a defective X gene, they send it to their daughter because the boys they only pass off the Y chromosome to their sons. But mothers can pass a defective gene with a 50 chance of the affected son and a 50 chance of having a daughter. I may have said that wrong when I'm talking, so just pause the video and just read. Now let's talk about these illnesses. Well, let's talk about the Marfan syndrome, and the genotype of this is autosomal dominant. So you only need one allele to be present for this disease to show. And this affects the connective tissue throughout your body, and it affects the skeleton, eyes, cardiovascular. And you can kind of see this, the signs and symptoms. You'll have like long arms, long fingers, hyperflexible joints, overcrowded teeth. And I put a picture up there so you can kind of reference to what I'm saying. So this condition really needs careful management, and you need to monitor and treat heart issues. And without proper treatment, serious stuff can happen. Now, this disease just breaks my heart, and it's also autosomal dominant because you only need one allele for this gene to have. So, this is a genetic mutation that causes progressive brain damage. But the crazy thing about this is neurological decline doesn't start until like you're age 40 and after. And then your mental health deteriorates and you start getting uncontrolled movements of the arms and legs. And symptoms usually start around age 35, and they kind of die off by age 55. But it's really sad. Like, this disease just stuck out to me. I don't know why, because it's like you're healthy for like your life and then just sick. PKU is autosomal recessive. So this means you need two alleles for this to happen. And this happens when the body lacks an enzyme needed to break down phenylalanine. I don't know how to say it, but it causes gradual mental R word. I don't know if I should say that, but signs like this is like the small head and delayed speech. Newborns are tested for the enzyme before leaving the hospital, and if it's missing, a special diet, like you'll avoid proteins, sweeteners, and dairy. And if you avoid that, the condition is pretty manageable. Now let's talk about the Tay-Sachs disease. And this is also autosomal recessive, so you need two alleles. And this happens because a missing enzyme needed to break down fats causes lipid buildup in the nervous system, and it leads to displacement of neurological tissue. So signs and symptoms for this: infants appear normal for the first few months of life, and then they develop severe neurological issues and they also start showing it by like a cherry red spot on the retina, blindness, deafness, paralysis. And this condition is fatal, and kids usually die around age 4, and is mainly common in Jewish populations. Now, Fragile X syndrome is literally what's the name. It's a mutation in the fMRI gene on the X chromosome, and it makes it fragile, and that affects brain development. And this cognitive stuff, it can range from mild to severe. The patient will have autistic-like behavior such as shyness, avoids eye contact, and physical features as you will see here. They usually have a long face, a large jaw, and enlarged testicles and hyperextendable joints. And this condition is lifelong, and individuals often need ongoing support and therapy for these challenges. But the symptoms can vary among affected individuals. So, pop quiz time. Let me go ahead and ask you guys two questions. So, what is meant by multifactorial inheritance, and give examples of the disease? So, this means you have a tendency to get health problems, but the way you go about it also gives an example, like diabetes. If diabetes runs in your family, but you want to eat fat stuff all the time, you're gonna get it. So, what is the pathophysiology of chromosomal disorders? And these disorders happen during meiosis, and that's the process that forms egg and sperms. The issue with these sometimes is chromosomes do not separate correctly during cell division. And most often, these disorders involve having too many or too few chromosomes. And I feel like the main chromosomal disorder that everybody knows is Down syndrome, which is also known as trisomy 21. And the risk factor behind this is the risk increases with maternal age. And I put a picture here so you can reference it, but they usually have a square-shaped head, upward slanting eye, low set ears, a protruding tongue, and they're also at increased risk of leukemia and Alzheimer's. Now let's look at Turner's syndrome and their signs and symptoms. So usually patients will have a short stature, a webbed neck, puffy hands, and feet. They don't ever go through puberty, so they no ovaries. They're sterile, and they're going to have abnormal kidneys and heart, and they're also going to have some scoliosis. Now, Polysommy X is kind of what I find interesting is when the male has an extra X chromosome, and this results males to develop female traits like breast. They'll have less facial and chest hair. They'll have a short torso with long arms and legs, a high-pitched voice, and underdeveloped testicles. So things to keep in mind, you may want to pause and look at prenatal diagnostic tools available and when you can use them. Environmentally influenced disorders. Keep in mind that exposure during the first 60 days post-conception have the most pronounced effect. Basically, when you're a baby, those first 60 days, if something happens to you, that's what's going to shape you. So that's all. Good luck, besties, and I wish you luck on the test.